Now, monocrop agriculture depends on vast quantities of pesticides, which indiscriminately kill flora and insects alike. What surprised me, however, and not in a good way, was the scale of pesticide use. The y-axis of this graph shows the agricultural use of glyphosate measured in millions of pounds. Now, understand that as weeds become resistant to pesticides, farmers respond by using more pesticides, a similar story to antibiotic resistant. But I was genuinely shocked to read this United Nations report which detailed that in 2020, more than 2 billion kilograms of pesticide were used around the world. In fact, over the last 30 years, annual pesticide use has averaged about 0.37 kilograms or 0.8 pounds for every single person every year. And 70% of that was applied in just the last 10 years. Doing the sums, if you're 30 years old, your share of pesticide application is more than 11 kilograms or 24 pounds. Let that sink in. Of course, this huge number is understandable when you realise how indiscriminately pesticides are used. This glyphosate product, for example, has been approved for application to wheat crops 6 days before harvest. Think about that. Do you really want your grains to have been sprayed with Roundup less than a week before harvest? Understand too that glyphosate accumulates in grains and cannot be removed by washing or broken down by cooking. Once it's there to stay. This is why Food Standards Australia and New Zealand was able to find glyphosate in several different types of bread, biscuits, crackers and cereals, including infant rice cereal. Of further concern to mothers is that glyphosates have also been found in breast milk. Now, one interesting area of research currently being pursued is examining the impacts of glyphosate-induced altered gut microbial populations on young children. Basically, Clostridium botulinum, a highly pathogenic bacterium capable of releasing a potent toxin, is highly resistant to glyphosate, which basically means glyphosate exposure can increase its abundance. And my understanding is that this bacterium has been associated with sudden infant death syndrome in at least 2 studies, with the paucity of further research to investigate this being somewhat puzzling. And before you carnivores out there get too smug, understand this potentially impacts you too. It's not an uncommon practice to feed cattle on cover crops that have been sprayed with pesticides, both to prepare a field for cropping and to save on animal feed. And this 2018 study assessed for the presence of glyphosates in various organs and tissues of cattle. Concerningly, glyphosate seemed to be fairly evenly distributed throughout the animals, though this was noticeably lower in cattle fed with organic feed. And this potentially has implications for whether or not you consume cattle raised in feedlots being fed crops adulterated with pesticides, or whether you choose grass-fed and finished cattle. As an obvious aside, consuming the grass-raised cattle is also going to be clearly better for the environment. This study also has some significant findings for vegans too. The level of glyphosate measured in the urine was significantly lower in humans consuming predominantly organic foods. And further, chronic illness was associated with significantly higher levels of urine glyphosates. And while this isn't proof of cause, in my mind, it certainly merits further research. In closing, nutrients from animal foods clearly offer benefit in terms of intelligence over unsupplemented vegan diets, which lack key nutrients required to sustain both body and mind. Secondly, we must be mindful of poor quality research, the findings often being presented as conclusive when this is far from the case. We ought to be wary of the many unsubstantiated claims demonising red meat, such as it lacking vitamin C, or causing bowel cancer, while also being aware of the environmental consequences of modern industrial agriculture. Finally, understand there is no such thing as a diet for which nothing has died.